Look, I'm not saying we were stupid. That's way too harsh. Short-sighted? Sure. Arrogant? Absolutely. But stupid? Well, okay, maybe a little. My name is Vex Torben, Senior Classification Officer for the Galactic Community of Sentient Species, or as we call it when the fancy diplomats aren't around, the Cosmic Zoo. Hey. Trust me, after 142 cycles in this job, you either develop a sense of humor or you end up like poor Krill Nastek, from accounting speaking exclusively in mathematical equations and collecting dust samples as a hobby. Let me explain how our galaxy works, or rather how we thought it worked before. The incident. The galactic community operates on a beautifully simple, perfectly logical classification system. Every species gets ranked based on their physical prowess, technological advancement, and threat assessment. At the top, you've got the Vrexthal, massive silicon-based beings who can bench press a small moon and survive in the vacuum of space while composing poetry about it. Show-offs, the lot of them. Then come the Nargalians with their psychic abilities and annoying habit of answering your questions before you ask them. Yes, your scales do look dull today. Vex, thanks for that, really. Down the line, we've got about 20 more classifications: the Zorbulans with their shape-shifting, the Pantari with their advanced weaponry, the Quilax with, well, nobody's quite sure what the Quilax do, but they're very intimidating with all those spines. And then, why at the bottom, we place the newest addition to our community, humans. Small, squishy, remarkably hairless except in the strangest places, and with absolutely no natural defenses to speak of. No claws, no venom. Not even a respectable set of teeth. Their planet? Mostly water that they can't even breathe in. What kind of evolutionary joke is that? When they first showed up at our galactic doorstep in their adorably primitive ships held together with, I kid you not, duct tape and hope, we practically tripped over ourselves trying not to laugh. We gave them the universal equivalent of a pat on the head and seated them at the back of the Galactic Council chamber, where we put all the harmless species. Oh boy, were we in for a surprise. The first time we actually encountered humans, not just their diplomatic team, but their species as a whole, was during the mandatory classification assessment. Every new species undergoes this process before formal admission to the Confederation. Usually it's a straightforward affair, but humans? They broke our evaluation matrix in ways that still make my head throb when I think about it. What do you mean you can't determine their primary evolutionary advantage? Barked Sub-Chancellor Trex at the poor classification officer, a brilliant Zolmith analyst named VZ Par. Every species has one. Dravax have strength, Quist have collective intelligence, Forox have telepathy. Just tell me what humans have. Vizzy's form shimmered with obvious distress. That's just it, sir. They don't seem to have specialized in anything. The data from Earth was perplexing, to say the least. Humans weren't particularly strong. A juvenile Dravax could bench press a small human vehicle. They weren't particularly fast. The slowest Nargalian could outrun their Olympic champions. Their sensory capabilities were embarrassingly limited, only 5 basic senses, and those barely functional by our standards. Can you believe they can't even see ultraviolet light? Like, naturally, what kind of evolutionary dead end? But here's where it got really weird. Despite lacking obvious advantages, humans had somehow become the dominant species on their planet. They'd outcompeted creatures with natural armor, venomous capabilities, superior strength, and better camouflage. How? Their history suggests they compensate for physical limitations with tool use, offered Vizzy, scrolling through Earth's historical database. But that's not uncommon. What is unusual is the sheer creativity and diversity of their technological development. Look at this, they have 37 different types of devices just for opening food containers. Perhaps their Class T intellectual evolutionaries, suggested another analyst. Like the Quist. Vizzy shook their head. Their average computational capacity is unremarkable. And yet look at these cognitive assessment results. They score below average on isolated logic problems, but off the charts on adaptive problem solving and contextual innovation. The confusion deepened when we reviewed their planetary history. Most advanced species have a relatively straightforward evolutionary narrative. The Dravax developed their strength to survive on a high-gravity world, the Forox evolved telepathy to hunt in absolute darkness, and so on. Humans? Their development was a chaotic mess of conflicting adaptations. They were simultaneously predator and prey. They could eat almost anything, but specialized in nothing. They could survive in environments ranging from scorching deserts to frozen tundras with minimal physiological adaptation. They just made tools and kept going. Perhaps their Class M environmental adapters, suggested another analyst, growing desperate. Vizzy sighed. Their bodies aren't particularly adaptable. They die easily from temperature extremes, pressure changes, radiation, but they've compensated with technology. They live underwater, in deserts, in Arctic conditions. Even in space environments that should have killed them by creating artificial bubbles that meet their narrow survival parameters. Sub-Chancellor Trex's eye stalks twitched with growing irritation. Just assign them something. The ceremonial seating chart for next week's council meeting needs to be finalized. The classification team eventually settled on Class D7 non-specialized endurance omnivores. Basically our nice way of saying we have no idea what these creatures are good at, but they're surprisingly hard to kill completely. We placed them at the very back of the council chamber, behind species with clear, understandable evolutionary advantages. After all, what threat could these unspecialized creatures possibly pose? They weren't the strongest, fastest, or smartest. They weren't the most technologically advanced. They were just persistent. We didn't realize then that persistence itself could be a superpower. That was our first mistake of many. You should have seen the day humans first arrived at Galactic Central. Their ship, if you could even call that rattling contraption a ship, limped into our docking bay trailing coolant and making this horrible wheezing noise. The diplomatic team practically had to wear ear protection. Several Navorians, the ones with the sensitive auditory membranes, actually passed out from the acoustic assault. What is? That demanded High Chancellor Drexvoth, all 7 of his eye stalks quivering with what I can only describe as aristocratic horror. I checked my datapad. Apparently it's called the Intrepid Explorer, sir. First human interstellar vessel. Intrepid? More like intrepid, ably still functioning, he snorted, which set off a wave of polite laughter among the welcoming committee. I mean, we weren't trying to be rude, but come on. The thing had actual duct tape visible on its hull. Tape. In space. When the airlock finally wheezed open after 3 failed attempts and what appeared to be someone kicking it from the inside out, stepped 5 humans in mismatched spacesuits that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts. Their leader, a female named Captain Eleanor Reed, removed her helmet and just smiled at us, like she wasn't even embarrassed. "Greetings from Earth," she announced, her voice surprisingly confident for someone whose ship looked like it might dissolve into component atoms at any moment. "We come in peace and friendship, seeking membership in your galactic community." The silence that followed was so profound you could have heard a microbial flutterby's wings. Then Chancellor Drexvoth did something unexpected. He laughed. Not the polite diplomatic chuckle, but a full-bodied, eye-stalk wobbling guffaw. "Well," he wheezed between ripples of amusement, "at least they have a sense of humor." The classification process was pure comedy. Humans scored lowest in nearly every category we measure. Physical strength, a Dravax infant could bench press 10 humans without breaking a sweat. Technological advancement? Their greatest achievement was getting to our station without accidentally flying into a star. Natural defenses? They bruise if you look at them too hard. During the defensive capabilities assessment, our weapons expert, General Clorna, actually dropped her datapad in shock. They use projectile weapons with actual solid ammunition. Like bits of metal, she sputtered, her dorsal spines flaring with disbelief. How do they even aim in space? The recoil alone would send them spinning for days. Apparently they don't really go into space to fight, I explained, reviewing their file. They mostly fight each other, on their planet. How charmingly primitive, she muttered, struggling to maintain her professional composure. The humans, to their credit, took all this with remarkable, dignity. They just stood there, smiling politely, occasionally asking intelligent questions about our procedures, completely unbothered by their obvious inferiority. It was almost admirable, in a pitiful sort of way. The final classification was unanimous. Humans Class D7 non-threatening species. They were assigned quarters in the protected species wing. of the station, the same area where we house the Florian empaths who communicate exclusively through pleasant aromas and the quantum jellyfish beautiful to look at, but about as threatening as colored lights. At the first full Galactic Council session they attended, humans were seated at the very back of the Grand Chamber, behind even the Whispering Moss representatives, who aren't even technically individual entities, but rather a collective consciousness inhabiting photosynthesizing filaments. "Don't worry about contributing much," I told Captain Reed as I showed them to their seats. "Just observe and learn. Perhaps in a few centuries, you'll advance enough to participate in the simpler discussions." She smiled. Humans do that a lot, and said, "We're just happy to be here. For now." Something about the way she said "for now" should have been our first clue. But we were too busy feeling smugly superior to notice. If only we'd paid more attention. Everything changed during the 87th cycle celebration, a grand diplomatic affair where species showcased their cultural achievements while secretly trying to one-up each other. The Dravax had just finished their traditional strength opera, 6 hours of synchronized boulder crushing set to a tonal humming, when the emergency alerts blared across every communication channel. "Attention all council members and diplomatic personnel," boomed the automated system, its voice modulated to convey maximum urgency without triggering panic. "Unknown hostile entity detected at Galactic Sector 9. Threat level catastrophic. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The reaction was immediate. The Quist Collective representatives simultaneously stood and began interfacing with their neural networks. The Dravax ambassador, General Korthvex, was already barking orders into 3 different communication devices. The Zolmeth representatives shimmered as they activated their reality-bending defensive matrices. Me? I was doing what any sensible bureaucrat does during a crisis, making sure the secure data servers were backing up properly while quietly calculating my pension benefits, just in case. The council chamber transformed into a war room within minutes. Holographic displays showed a spreading darkness engulfing star systems at the galaxy's outer rim. Whatever this thing was, it moved fast and left only dead planets in its wake. Preliminary analysis indicates it's consuming energy at the quantum level, reported Chief Scientist Lorax of the Forux. Her facial tentacles writhed with agitation, never a good sign from a species known for their emotional control. "It's like nothing we've ever encountered. It's not just destroying planets, it's erasing the very fabric of space-time." "The Dravax Armada stands ready," announced General Korthvex, pounding his chest with enough force to crack bureaucrat. "We will crush this threat as we have crushed all enemies of the Confederation." The resulting battle was, well, let's call it humbling. The Dravax fleet, supposedly invincible, returned with half their ships missing and the other half barely functional. General Korthvex, once proud and boastful, looked shell-shocked. "It absorbs energy," he reported, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Our weapons made it stronger. Each blast, each torpedo, it just consumed the energy and grew. We couldn't even get close enough for physical combat." Next, the Quist Collective deployed their legendary tactical fleet ships piloted by the most brilliant military minds in the galaxy, capable of predicting enemy movements before they happened. They returned 3 days later, their hive mind fractured, their pilots babbling nonsense. "It thinks in patterns we cannot comprehend," their prime nexus explained, its usual synchronized voices now discordantly overlapping. "We tried to predict its movements, but it operates on logic that defies our analytical frameworks. It's as if it exists partially outside our dimensional understanding." The Zolmeth attempted to contain it with their reality-warping technology. They failed spectacularly, losing an entire battle group in the process. "It bent our dimensional bubbles back upon themselves," their high manipulator reported, his usual shimmering form now flickering erratically. "Whatever this entity is, it understands the fabric of reality better than we do." The Forux telepaths couldn't establish mental contact. The granular molecular shifters were torn apart at the atomic level when they approached. Every single top-tier species in our hierarchy tried and failed to even slow this thing down. The council chamber, once buzzing with confident strategic planning, fell silent. For the first time in recorded history, the most powerful beings in the galaxy sat together in helpless silence. The threat was now in Sector 7, consuming planets at an accelerating rate. Projections showed it would reach the core worlds within weeks. High Chancellor Drexvoth, looking suddenly very old, despite his regenerative capabilities, sighed heavily. "We have exhausted our strategic options. If anyone has any suggestion, no matter how unlikely or desperate, Now is the time. That's when I noticed movement from the back of the chamber. A small figure standing up from those distant, forgotten seats reserved for non-threatening species. Captain Eleanor Reed of Earth, her face calm but determined, raised her hand. "We might be able to help," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent chamber. The Chancellor blinked all 7 eyes in surprise, as if just remembering humans existed. "You?" he asked incredulously. "What could you possibly do when the greatest powers in the galaxy have failed?" Captain Reed smiled, that same confident smile from when they'd first arrived in their tape-patched ship. "With respect, Chancellor," she replied, "sometimes the problem isn't about having the biggest stick. It's about having the right tool." The entire council chamber erupted in a mixture of disbelieving laughter and indignant sputtering. I mean, can you blame them? Imagine the weakest, softest, most technologically backward species in the room offering help when the galaxy's mightiest civilizations had just gotten their collective backsides handed to them. Chancellor Drexvoth's eye stalks quivered with what might have been amusement, if the situation weren't so dire. "Captain Reed, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is hardly the time for." "With all due respect," interrupted another human commander, Raj Patel, their science officer, "we've been analyzing the data feeds from each of your encounters with the entity." "You've been what?" demanded General Korthvex, his massive frame rising indignantly. "Those feeds are classified tactical information." The humans exchanged glances. Another one, Dr. Lena Novak, I think, cleared her throat. "You, broadcast them on open frequencies during the battles. We just listened." I couldn't help myself. I laughed. The mighty Dravax general, outsmarted because he forgot to encrypt his transmissions. The look on his face was priceless, somewhere between murderous rage and embarrassed realization. He sank back into his seat with a growl that made the floor vibrate. Captain Reed stepped forward, motioning to a younger human who carried what looked like a primitive data projector. "May we?" she asked, nodding toward the central holographic platform. Chancellor Drexvoth waved a weary hand. At this point, what harm could it do? "Proceed." The young human Lieutenant Marcus Chen, their tech specialist, connected their device to our systems. For a horrifying moment, I thought it might crash our entire network, but surprisingly, a clear holographic model appeared in the center of the chamber. "We believe you're not dealing with a single entity," Dr. Novak explained, adjusting her glasses, an archaic visual aid humans still use for some reason. "You're facing a swarm intelligence composed of billions of quantum-entangled particles that exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional states." The Zolmith representatives leaned forward, their shimmering forms intensifying with interest. "Each time you attacked it with energy weapons," continued Commander Patel, "you essentially fed it exactly what it needs to maintain cohesion across dimensions. The more energy you directed at it, the stronger the quantum entanglement became." Lieutenant Chen tapped at his device, and the hologram shifted to show battle footage from the Dravax fleet. "See here? When your battleships fired, the entity's outer layer actually reached out to intercept the energy blasts, rather than avoid them." The council chamber had gone completely silent. Even the usually chatty, whispering moss had stopped their constant rustle of communication. "So what do you propose?" asked High Manipulator Zex of the Zolmith, his voice uncharacteristically respectful. "If we cannot attack it with energy, or attempt to manipulate its dimensional properties?" Captain Reed nodded to another human, a quiet, unassuming man who hadn't spoken before. "This is Professor James Wong, Earth's leading expert in theoretical physics, and well, we call it thinking outside the box." Professor Wong stepped forward, looking almost comically small next to the holographic display of the cosmic horror that was devouring our galaxy. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "The entity exists partly in dimensions we can't directly access," he explained, "but it has to manifest in our reality to feed. That's its vulnerability. We need to disrupt its quantum entanglement pattern at precisely the moment it's most fully manifested in our dimension." "And how do you propose to do that?" snapped General Korthvex. "With your primitive projectile weapons?" Perhaps several Dravax officers chuckled derisively. Professor Wong smiled slightly. "Actually, yes, sort of." The laughter died immediately. "Your weapons are all energy-based," Captain Reed explained. "Plasma cannons, quantum disruptors, reality warpers, they all manipulate energy in some form. But humans, well, We've spent most of our history finding extraordinarily creative ways to hit things really hard with physical objects. Lieutenant Chen brought up a new holographic image, a surprisingly simple-looking device. This is what we call a kinetic impactor, Professor Wong continued. It doesn't use energy weapons at all. It's essentially a very large, very dense mass accelerated to near relativistic speeds. Pure kinetic energy, no lasers, no plasma, no exotic particles. "You want to throw rocks at it?" asked Chief Scientist Lorex incredulously, her facial tentacles curling in disbelief. "Not rocks," corrected Professor Wong. "Specifically designed impactors made of complex carbon lattices that will shatter in a precise pattern on impact, disrupting the quantum field just enough to break the entanglement. And we've got something else the entity hasn't encountered yet," added Commander Patel with a grin. "Something that might just give us an edge." "And what might that be?" asked the Chancellor, now leaning forward with genuine curiosity. Captain Reed's smile widened. "Humans are really, really good at improvising when things go wrong. It's practically our superpower." She gestured around at the assembled aliens. "Your species evolved to be stronger, faster, smarter in specific ways. But humans? We evolved to be adaptable. We're not the best at anything, except maybe adaptation itself. When our plans fail, and they often do, we don't freeze up. We don't retreat to recalculate. We pivot. We adapt. We overcome." The chamber remained silent as the implications sank in. These soft, weak creatures with their laughably primitive technology were proposing to save the galaxy with what amounted to sophisticated rocks and improvisation. You know what's absolutely hilarious? Watching the mightiest military commanders in the galaxy being lectured on battle tactics by creatures whose greatest natural defense is the ability to sweat profusely. I'm not joking, humans actually expel water through their skin to cool themselves. How they didn't evolve themselves into permanent dehydration is beyond me. But there we were, in the Grand Strategic Command Center, watching as Captain Reed and her team transformed our most advanced war room into what they called a mission control center. They brought in their own equipment, chunky, almost primitive-looking devices that they somehow integrated with our quantum computing arrays. The Quist Collective representatives looked physically pained every time the humans plugged another cable into our systems. "Are you certain these interfaces won't compromise our networks?" asked Prime Nexus Chiral, their multi-voiced concern barely concealing their horror. Lieutenant Chen didn't even look up from his work. "Nope, but they probably will anyway. We'll fix it later." The casual confidence. The audacity. I nearly choked on my nutrient supplement. The human plan was, to put it mildly, unconventional. They had requested and somehow received permission to modify 16 of our largest cargo haulers. The Dravax provided reluctant engineering support, their massive forms awkwardly following the instructions of humans half their size. The modifications involved stripping the ships of all non-essential systems and loading them with what the humans called kinetic penetrators, essentially gigantic bullets made of specialized carbon lattice materials. "We're going to need pilots," Captain Reed announced as the preparations neared completion. "The best you have." General Korthvex snorted derisively. "Our finest pilots are already recovering from neural shock after the first engagement. Besides, these modified vessels are barely more than guided missiles. The pilots would be on a suicide mission." Captain Reed nodded gravely. "We know. That's why my team and I will be flying them." The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the subtle hum of the artificial gravity generators. "You will pilot them yourselves?" Chancellor Drexvoth asked, his eye stalks quivering with confusion. "But you're diplomats, scientists, not warriors." Commander Patel laughed, actually laughed in the face of imminent death. "Chancellor, on Earth, our scientists invented our weapons. Our diplomats have often been our best strategists. And all of us," he gestured to the assembled human team, "have military training. It's sort of a prerequisite for space exploration, where we come from. Besides," added Dr. Novak with a wry smile, "we're expendable, right? Class D7 non-threatening species and all that." Oh, the burn. Several council members had the grace to look embarrassed. The battle itself, well, if I hadn't witnessed it personally through the command center's feeds, I wouldn't have believed it. The 16 modified cargo ships, each piloted by a human volunteer, approached the cosmic entity in a formation that made no tactical sense to our military analysts. They're scattered too widely, observed General Korthvex with a frown. No concentration of force. This approach violates every principle of. It's not about principles, interrupted Professor Wong, who was coordinating from the command center. It's about creating unpredictability. The entity has shown it can anticipate conventional attack patterns. As the ships entered the entity's perimeter, something fascinating happened. Rather than charging straight in as our forces had done, the human pilots began executing what looked like completely random maneuvers: sharp turns, sudden accelerations, brief retreats, and nonsensical course changes. What are they doing? Demanded High Manipulator Zex, his shimmering form fluctuating with agitation. Confusing it, responded Professor Wong calmly. The entity expects logical attack patterns, so we're being illogical. Humans call it juking, added the only human who had remained behind, a communications specialist named Olivia Diaz, making your movements unpredictable so your opponent can't anticipate where you'll be. The entity, which had previously shown remarkable precision in intercepting our ships, seemed to struggle with the humans' erratic flight patterns. Its energy tendrils lashed out, but often missed as the human pilots executed maneuvers that our simulators insisted were aerodynamically inadvisable, if not impossible. Yeehaw! Missed me again, you quantum bastard, came the voice of Lieutenant Chen over the comms. Several council members looked scandalized at the breach of communication protocol, but I found myself suppressing a smile. The first penetrator hit its mark. A human pilot named Rodriguez managed to get close enough to launch before his ship was engulfed. The specialized projectile, traveling at near relativistic speed, punched straight through the entity's outer layer. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, a visible shudder rippled through the cosmic horror. "It's working," shouted Commander Patel over the comms. "Targeting data confirmed. All ships adjust to new coordinates." What followed was both magnificent and terrible. One by one, the human pilots sacrificed themselves to deliver their kinetic payloads. With each impact, the entity's cohesion visibly deteriorated. Its massive form began to flicker and distort, like reality itself was hiccuping around it. Final approach came. Captain Reed's calm voice, the last pilot remaining. Her ship was damaged, trailing debris, but still maneuverable. All data shows critical destabilization of the entity's quantum field. One more hit should. Her transmission cut off as her ship disappeared into the writhing mass of the entity. For several agonizing moments, nothing happened. Then, a blinding flash erupted from the center of the cosmic horror. When our sensors recovered, the entity was changing, contracting, collapsing in on itself. "They did it," whispered Chancellor Drex Volth, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "They actually did it." As the entity imploded into nothingness, leaving only empty space where moments before had been galaxy-ending doom, the Strategic Command Center erupted in cheers, roars, telepathic jubilation, and whatever other forms of celebration our diverse species engaged in. I found myself staring at the now empty view screen, a strange feeling in my chest cavity. These humans, these soft, weak, technologically primitive beings we had so casually dismissed, had just saved the galaxy using modified cargo ships, fancy rocks, and what they called thinking on their feet. Most disturbing of all, they had done it by deliberately sacrificing themselves, without hesitation, without lengthy strategic debates, without ego-driven posturing. They had simply identified what needed to be done and did it. Perhaps, I realized with growing discomfort, we had misclassified them rather severely. The memorial ceremony was uncomfortable. And I'm not talking about the physical discomfort of standing for 6 hours in the Grand Chamber, though that certainly didn't help. No, it was uncomfortable because every single species in the Galactic Confederation was confronting the same awkward truth we had catastrophically misjudged humans. The massive chamber, usually arranged with the most powerful species in the front and the insignificant ones in the back, had been completely reorganized. A circular arrangement now, with no species placed higher or lower than another. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, especially not the Vrexthal, who looked positively constipated about being positioned next to the whispering moss. Chancellor Drex Volth spoke first, his voice uncharacteristically humble. "Today we honor the human warriors who sacrificed themselves to save not just their own world, but all of ours. In doing so, they have taught us that power manifests in many forms, not all of them immediately apparent. The remaining humans, there were only 9 left from their original diplomatic team, stood solemnly as holographic images of their fallen comrades floated above the central platform. Captain Eleanor Reed, Commander Patel, Dr. Novak, Lieutenant Chin, faces now known throughout the galaxy. Heroes who had flown to certain death without a moment's hesitation. "We had classified humans as non-threatening," continued the Chancellor, his eye stalks drooping with regret. "We were correct, but for entirely wrong reasons. Humans are indeed non-threatening to those who mean no harm. But when faced with an existential danger, they transform into something formidable." General Korthvex, looking uncharacteristically subdued, stepped forward. "The human approach to warfare defies our established doctrine. They do not overwhelm with superior strength. They do not outmaneuver with superior speed. Instead, they adapt, they improvise. They overcome limitations through sheer stubborn creativity." The Quist Collective's Prime Nexus spoke next, their synchronized voices filled with something like admiration. "Human minds function differently than ours. Where we seek optimal solutions through logical progression, they make intuitive leaps. Where we hesitate when faced with insufficient data, they make decisions anyway and adjust as they go. It is highly irregular and undeniably effective." I couldn't help but notice that several species were looking nervously at the remaining humans. The same question hung in everyone's mind: what other surprises might these unpredictable creatures have in store? Professor Wong, now serving as the acting human ambassador, seemed to sense the unease. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "We understand your concerns," he said, addressing the entire assembly. "You've just discovered that we're not quite what you thought we were. That can be unsettling." Masterful understatement. Several nervous chuckles rippled through the chamber. "But humanity didn't come to the stars seeking conquest or dominance," he continued. "We came seeking knowledge, friendship, and the chance to be part of something greater than ourselves. That hasn't changed." He paused, looking around at the assembled representatives. "What has changed, I hope, is that you now see us as we truly are, not harmless pets to be tolerated, but allies with different but complementary strengths. We don't want to sit in the front row, but perhaps we've earned the right not to be hidden in the back." The chamber erupted in thunderous approval, stamping appendages, flashing bioluminescence, telepathic waves of affirmation, and every other manner of alien applause. Later, as the formal proceedings concluded and representatives mingled in what humans might call a reception, I found myself standing next to Professor Wong. "So," I ventured, still trying to process everything I'd witnessed, "was this your plan all along? To demonstrate your capabilities by saving us from a cosmic horror?" He laughed, that disarming human sound that somehow puts you at ease even when you're feeling anxious. "Krazak, if we could manufacture cosmic horrors, we'd be a lot higher on your threat assessment scale." I chuckled despite myself. "Fair point. Though I suspect our classification system may need some revisions." Perhaps he agreed, sipping from a glass of what I hoped was non-toxic refreshment. Or perhaps the lesson here is that no classification system can ever be perfect. Life, whether human or alien, has a way of surprising you. As I watched the various species interacting with the humans, the mighty Dravax leaning down to hear their words, the telepathic Foruks making actual verbal sounds to communicate with them, I realized something profound was happening. The galaxy's strongest species had learned an important lesson: true strength isn't always about who has the biggest muscles, the most advanced technology, or the most fearsome natural weapons. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones in the back of the room, the ones you've dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated, who turn out to be exactly what you need when everything else fails. As for humans, they're still sitting in the back of the council chamber by choice now, but everyone knows they're not there because they're insignificant. They're there because that's where you put your secret weapons.